The United States claims to disagree with China on a number of subjects, despite the message of better relations. The first fruits of the deal came nearly 2 weeks after U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken traveled to Beijing for intense talks aimed at deepening U.S.-China ties, and announced 4 days of talks with Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen that will begin Thursday. To visit China. In a successful joint venture, the People's Bank of China announced on Saturday that Pan Gongsheng, who has served as vice president at the People's Bank of China for more than a decade, has been appointed secretary at the financial institution. Wall Street Magazine. That fired him for governor. My hope for going to China is to reconnect, Yellen said in an interview last week before announcing her trip. There's a new board and we need to get to know each other. The two countries should discuss our differences so that there are no misunderstandings and we do not misunderstand each other. If the visit goes well, other U.S. officials may follow suit, and high-ranking Chinese officials are expected to visit the U.S. When Blinken visited Beijing, China agreed to communicate or reopen communications beyond military channels. As Blinken confirmed at the end of his visit, progress is not the result of a visit, a trip, a meeting. The relationship is discussed daily, with many charges against China pending in Washington and Democrats, including President Joe Biden. Blinken leaves Beijing for the first time. This happened the next day, when Biden did not hesitate to call Chinese President Xi Jinping as head of fundraising. It seems odd that the president is willing to take offense at the scandal that the Secretary of State has just started. Although Biden's dictatorial words were described as political aggression by the Chinese Foreign Ministry, China has made it clear that the agreement is still valid. The CCP's spokesperson, People's Daily, released a statement on June 22 with the headline, "China and the United States must meet halfway through to stabilize and improve relations between both sides." China is committed to establishing a stable, predictable, and harmonious relationship with the United States. Agreed to allow senior leaders to meet on maintaining bilateral relations and maintaining open lines of communication. Both sides agree that Blinken will visit China to follow up on their talks. They agreed. Sino-Chinese relations have deteriorated since then House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan in August last year, despite strong opposition from China. In retaliation, Beijing closed many lines of communication with Washington. Blinken's flight to Beijing was scheduled for February, but was delayed due to the highly publicized spy bubble incident that had become a political hazard. Therefore, the Prime Minister did not arrive in China for a 2-day meeting until the end of June. But as Blinken himself admits, 2 days of meetings are not enough to resolve deep issues. For example, the last military incident, he said, was the result of information conflict, not poor communication. The incident occurred in the Taiwan Strait on June 3. According to U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, a Chinese missile intercepted Zhongyun in its port before turning to starboard about 150 yards from its bow. This forced the U.S. Navy to speed up their maneuvers to avoid a collision. No misunderstanding, though. China's move is deliberate to attack U.S. Navy ships in the area without prior permission from China. This reflects the opposing interpretation of international law by both countries. Communication cannot solve this important problem. USA. It was also mentioned that Chinese Premier General Li Shangfu refused to meet with Defense Minister Lloyd Austin. However, Li was sanctioned by the United States and was not allowed to visit the United States. For Washington, asking to meet with a leader without lifting sanctions would be seen as an insult. The United States should reconsider its self-imposed sanctions on relations with China. Hong Kong President Li Keqiao is another person to whom the U.S. has imposed sanctions. The United States is hosting the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation in 2023, with a leaders' meeting scheduled for November in San Francisco. Usually, the host country extends the invitation to 20 more members each year. Earlier this year, the State Department informed Congress that the United States wishes to invite Li. But oddly enough, on June 13, the department reported to Congress that previous information was incorrect and had no jurisdiction. The rectification came after a letter from 4 members of the House of Representatives, 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats, on June 7 urged the Commerce Department to suspend the Hong Kong director. Biden's leadership seems to be in a dilemma. On the one hand, he has the responsibility to invite all APEC members, and on the other hand, he faces pressure to lead the host. But believe that Biden wants to host Xi Jinping in San Francisco. Washington could thwart another U.S. opportunity by not inviting the Hong Kong leader. The meeting in China, which will raise Biden's profile as a world leader and increase his chances of being re-elected. Foreign policy and domestic policy are intertwined. From the point of view of the government, China's problem will last for many years. But if it fails in the 2024 elections, there will be no going back. Biden talked about building railings and building a structure for better relations with China. Even if there are other agreements, one principle should be that both parties oppose the other leader. After all, in a crisis, these two need to work together to find a solution. Some analysts have pointed out that not only is Biden paying more for the election rather than creating the bottom line for relations with China, but the foreign team law is crucial to political elections. Dennis Wilder said in an email, the goal of focusing on domestic politics, which Biden and his foreign policy team paid for, cannot be compromised. The difference with this group is that key people like Blinken and Jack Sullivan are national security experts as well as political experts. Wilder compared the situation to the Bush administration, which appointed foreign policy experts such as Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice as Secretary of State, and Stephen Trump as national security advisors, according to their assignments. Domestic politics can have long-term effects on foreign relations. The New York Times, June 27, the American view of China is beginning to differ. The Soviet Union looked like 10 years ago, this May. So even if Biden wants to improve relations with Beijing, the American public may oppose it. The Economist asked the U.S. more enemy than ever before. More YouGov polls during the Biden and Trump administrations. The New York Times reported that the information Americans receive about China from their leaders is negative and that the influence of public opinion will harm the U.S.-China relationship. If the United States develops a national habit of seeing the enemy, it seems to be a repeat of the Cold War, in which the governments and people of both countries were hostile to each other. There will be no winners, only losers. Responsible leaders of both countries, especially the United States, must act now to ensure this does not happen. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said the U.S. and China should communicate directly on certain trade issues, and reiterated the need for more trade between both sides during her meeting with Chinese leaders. Yellen told Chinese Vice President He Lifeng that Beijing and Washington can make better decisions to strengthen their economic ties if they discuss various challenges in complex international trade. I believe that a large area of our economy can be affected in a way that does not interfere with government, Yellen said during a meeting with He Jiankui on Saturday. Despite recent tensions, the fact that we broke a bilateral trade record in 2022 shows that there is ample room for our businesses to trade and invest. At a time when Sino-American relations are at their worst in decades, Beijing is stepping up its efforts to influence American politics, media, and society. China maintains a pattern of interventionist activity that began in the Pacific Rim in the early 2000s, trying to change the narrative in its favor and backing officials in Beijing, sometimes only promising confusion and lies. U.S. law enforcement is stepping up efforts to influence the 2022 midterm elections, and Google and Meta's cybersecurity units are sounding the alarm about Beijing-backed online communications during the midterm elections. Global advertising campaign. While Beijing is relatively new to supporting operations in the United States, it has spent years developing a strategy for influencing politics and elections in the Pacific region. In Australia, those involved in Beijing paid directly to key politicians in Australian foreign policy to try to improve relations with China. In New Zealand, Taiwan, and parts of Southeast Asia, China is supporting businessmen in Beijing to control many local Chinese media. Key issues for U.S.-Com, China and U.S. reconciliation. Both the U.S. and China have struggled to portray their relationship as different from others. Although President Biden is preparing for a Cold War, he denied that he wants to be involved in this war. The U.S. Department of Commerce's announcement in October 2022 to limit maximum energy imports to China is a good example. Not giving intelligence to the Chinese military and government surveillance also means not giving it to Chinese medical scientists, farmers, teachers, supply chain managers, and transportation and communications experts. Showing that the U.S. strategy is to prevent further development of the Chinese.